Welcome to the Columbia Global Center. We are pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Andrea Cassatella for a talk on Is Democracy Secular? Andrea is currently a visiting fellow here at the Columbia Global Center, where he has been working on his book manuscript entitled Beyond the Secular, Jacques Derrida and the Theologico-Political Complex. Prior to coming to Amman, Dr. Cassatella was an assistant professor of humanities and head of the core division at Al-Quds Bard College for Arts and Science at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem from 2017 to 2019. His research interests are in modern European philosophy and political theory, critical and decolonial thought, as well as Islamic political thought and religion and politics. He obtained his PhD in political theory from the University of Toronto in 2015, where he also served as a lecturer in social sciences. Prior to his doctoral studies, Dr. Cassatella served as Community Service Officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, missions in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Djibouti. His work on Derrida, secularism, and cultural translation has been published in several international peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. Andrea's talk this evening on Is Democracy Secular will reflect on the nature and future of democracy, turning to the work of Jacques Derrida to interrogate whether secularism is one of democracy's necessary and desirable features. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Cassatella.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Unfortunately, my talk this time will be in English. My Arabic is not as good yet to deliver a talk in Arabic. First of all, I would like to thank you everybody for being here, and a special thanks to the member of the center. Safwan is not here, Ania, Ahmad, and everybody who's part of the staff for hosting me, and especially for giving me the possibility of presenting my reflection on political community on ongoing work. In this talk, I reflect on democracy more as a political imaginary than as a regime, a political imaginary that is based roughly on the value of freedom and equality. And I do so in the light of the question of secularism. Why democracy? Well, because it appears to be of universal value, which is not the same as saying of universal validity, especially if you look at the experiences post-World War II across the world. Starting from processes of decolonization in the 60s in Africa, to the democratization of the Asia-Pacific in the 70s, in South America in the 80s, in Eastern Europe in the 90s, and maybe in the Arab world more recently. In fact, I think that the invocation of liberty, justice, and dignity during the Arab Springs were very close, if not inscribed, in demands for democracy. I pursue my reflection through the thought of Jacques Derrida, which I explore in my ongoing book manuscript. For those who are not familiar with Jacques Derrida, was a Franco-Algerian Jewish philosopher from, in fact, Algeria, but is mostly associated to Paris and post-structuralism and postmodernism. His thought is considered, has been labeled as deconstruction, and is mostly assimilated as a white male thinker, what I think is a Mediterranean thinker. What does it mean? It means that he had an experience, in fact, of colonial modernity, and the experience of colonial modernity transpires, in fact, in his thought. And in particular, when we think about the question of religion and secularism, Derrida experienced it and articulated through the figure of the Arab Jew, that today seems a political impossibility for sure, but also a conceptual impossibility, especially in this part of the region, in this part of the world. So why Derrida? Well, I believe, and this is the hypothesis that I would like to run with you today, that he offers a key resources to think about democracy beyond the modern hegemonic understandings and form. Although Derrida addressed both issues of democracy and secularism, he left their relationship somehow undeveloped. So my exploration seeks to think with him, but also go beyond him. As it appears for the title of the talk, I'm asking, indeed I'm questioning, whether democracy is secular, need to be secular, or is desirable for it to be secular in order to be democracy at all. So my reflection aims at offering a critical understanding of the domain of the political, which is today in the imaginary or in practice, mostly coextensive with the democratic. So if the democratic is desirable, and this is not really the focus of my talk, I want to inquire on what democracy requires in order to be democracy at all. I should have done this before, but okay. Okay, so my talk will be divided roughly in two parts. In the first part, I address the question of secularism to define the contour of my intervention, and then I move to the question of democracy. Now, if you think about a question of secularism today, in the last 30 years, what seems to have been at the center of political discourse and practice, it is the so-called return of religion. Reference to religion, and in many cases to its violent manifestation and urgent necessity to respond to it, has been often associated with a variety of political contexts, events, and situations, starting with the conflict in the Balkans in ex-Yugoslavia in the 90s, jumping to the 9/11 or the Danish cartoon controversy, to the Islamophobic legislation in Europe and the United States, following, in fact, 9/11, and justified in the name of secularism and security, thinking forward to the continuous trend of evangelical politics in North America, Pentecostalism in Latin America and Africa, most recently the Arab Springs, the affirmation of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, the ongoing settler colonialism in Israel against Palestinians, terrorist action of Islamist group in West Africa, Boko Haram, or a variety of anti-Muslim legislation and state policies in India, Myanmar, and China. So this situation taken together raises the question of how to respond today to what is considered the old theological political question, which I understand as how the relationship between religion and politics is implicated in the foundation of knowledge, political community, and political authority. So in order to understand the problematic, it seems to me that we have to understand the framework within which we navigate. And so this is commonly understood as modernity, modern discourse, which include the modern discourse of religion. So we have to understand the political grammar through which we understand, in fact, the reality at our disposal. And this is characterized roughly by four fundamental concepts. The first is the concept of religion. Now, scholars of religion have pointed out that the term religion has a Christian origin, and its definition, it's inscribed in Christian history. Especially since the Reformation, religion is considered, in fact, a question of belief. In fact, the right to religion, or freedom of religion, is based on freedom of conscience. Now, the applicability of the generic term religion to a variety of non-Christian tradition and context raises questions about classification and geopolitics that regard the political dimension of the production of knowledge. Indeed, the persistence of Orientalism with colonial and racialized features formation goes much beyond the formation of Orientalism as a discipline. They go back, in my understanding, to the period of Al-Andalus. Correlative to the question of religion is the question of the secular. Now, if you look at the etymology of the secular, it comes from the Latin seculum, which means worldly or temporal. It is a theological concept that was used to refer, in fact, to the worldly temporal space and time, as opposed to the otherworldly one. Now, in modern time and through process of secularization, there has been an ideological inversion where the concept of the secular become, in fact, an epistemological category separated, indeed free from religion. It is from assessing. It is by going, in fact, to a secular space that we look at what is the nature of religion. Secularization is another category. By secularization is generally meant, in fact, an explanatory, sociological, and historical category that looks at the process of differentiation between the religious and other spheres, the economic, the political, and the scientific one. Now, it is often associated to a narrative of civilization. Humanity has gone for a period where religion was dominant. Then with the advent of science and modernization and modernity, religion has been considered progressively as an illusion. And so it has gone in the private sphere, first of all, and then it is in decline. Now, this has been proved false also for many Western society. And what is problematic about this view is that, I'm just going to click. What is problematic about this view is that until up very recently, it was considered, in fact, universally true, and so generally applicable across the board. Finally, we have the question of secularism. Secularism is considered as a normative doctrine that regards how should we conceive the relation between religion and politics. And since the 17th century experience of war of religion in Europe, religion and politics should be separated. And this is done in view of guaranteeing tolerance, peace, and human development. But at a deeper level, it's not simply a theory about the separation between religion and politics, because it presupposes, secularism presupposes an understanding of what counts as knowledge. Knowledge is rational, based only on reason. What counts as public morality, based in fact only on rationality and not on faith. And what counts as subjectivity. The subject is one that can autonomously choose what type of ethics to follow, rather than inhabiting the norm that somebody has received. And so, although all these elements might have had a variety of configuration, especially beyond the West, what I want to stress is that they have played an hegemonic role in the extension of modernity across the globe in process of globalization. And especially, we have to think about that before the experience of colonization, in a non-Christian context, there was no need, in fact, to organize life according to secular terms, secular understanding and secular values. So how to respond to the question of the return of religion today if we live in a modern discourse characterized, in fact, by this element? Now, is it the return of religion, is it due to a failure of secularism or a lack of secularism? There should be more secularism? Now, first of all, to talk about the return of religion is problematic in itself. In fact, it presupposes the theory of secularization that in fact questions. In fact, you can speak of a return if you think that a religion was ever gone. But the return of religion itself is questioning the very idea of secularization. And is also questioning the very idea of separation between religion and politics that is traversing, in fact, the question of the secular, of secularization, and of secularism. So in my understanding, the return of religion signaled the crisis, in fact, of the modern secular discourse, and the difficulties of providing, in fact, universal explanation about political and religious reality. Most of all, the difficulty consists in the fact that modern secular discourse seems to be ubiquitous and transcending all context. So we always already are in modern secular discourse. It has gone so far that it's been internalized, in my understanding, not simply at the cognitive level, whether we accept it or respond or react to it, but it's also shaped, in fact, ethos and sensibility, whether we accept them or not. And so the question is how to rethink today the relationship between religion and politics, which it's more of a question of how do we rethink, in fact, difference. And I think we have to reflect on how, whence, and from which cultural tradition, in fact, we approach all this question. And so it becomes a question of moving away from a Western-centric understanding of what the relationship is about. So in that sense, Derrida, I think, is helpful in rethinking the entire problematic. Derrida was at the forefront of thinking of the return of religion itself, and the category of secularization has been inscribed in Christian history. For him, the very problem of thinking the modern world through the category of religion is that, do we know what religion is beyond non-Christian context? In other words, can we perceive what religious difference is beyond the concept of religion? Does it become legible or recognizable? More problematic still, the traditional understanding of secularism and secularization as a form of separation relies on a form of separatist and hierarchical thinking that, in fact, supposes that the secular and reason are subordinated, superior, in fact, to religion. And so they can discriminate between acceptable form of public religion and an unacceptable one. But the question arises, what is the center that guarantees the stability of the distinction between religious and non-religious, or religious and political, reason and faith? For Derrida, the roots of this type of thinking is what he calls a metaphysical presence, which is a type of metaphysical thinking associated to the tradition of the West. This is a form of foundational thinking. It can establish fundamental grounds through conceptual understanding. And so the idea is that we can grasp the essence of reality independently from the condition in which, the mediating condition in which we operate, meaning language, culture, history, and politics. Now, beside having little historical sensibility and provided a ground for hierarchies between the secular, the religious, but we'll see also the sexual and racial hierarchy, this type of metaphysical thinking has a deeper problem. I want to read this quote from an essay in the 70s. Derrida says, metaphysics, the white mythology, which reassemble and reflect the culture of the West. The white man takes on his own mythology, the Indo-European mythology, his own logos, that is, the mythos of its idiom, for the universal form that he must still wish to call reason, which does not go uncontested. White mythology, metaphysics, has erased within itself the fabulous scene that has produced it, the scene that nevertheless remained active and stirring, inscribed in white ink, an invisible design covered over in the palimpsest. So what Derrida points to here is the racial connotation of Western thinking, and more broadly, the material condition of possibility of an hegemony based on racialized strategies and understanding. So this condition refers, in fact, to the logic and strategy of naturalization of a particular life form that articulates a view of reason as reason with capital R. And this view, on the one side, denies, in fact, the relationality of human experience and other understanding of logos or reason, but does not go uncontested. And on the other side, it hides, in fact, the contingent condition in which this all occur. It erases the fabulous scene that has produced it. Derrida doesn't mention it here, but throughout his work, the fabulous scene refers, in fact, to colonialism, capitalism, and the globalization of the nation state, the secular nation state. So taking together the question of foundationalism, hierarchical thinking, and relationship to a form of racialized thinking, the question becomes whether this foundationalism is not also a form of fundamentalism. There is a sense in which there is a logic of what is the most fundamental between reason and faith, the religious and the secular. And whether, in fact, fundamentalism are, in fact, also a response to secular fundamentalism. More problematic, if this whole element circulated around the world through process of globalization, what we really have is not the extension of universal value, but in fact we have the extension of the interpretative framework and institution that are indebted, in fact, to Western Christianity. That is why Derrida called globalization, from French, mondialatinisation, which in English has been translated as global Latinization. And so the idea is that originally European colonial and then Anglo-American form of imperialist imposition in the name of peace, what is extended worldwide is the hegemonic Christian juridico-theological political culture and its institution in the form of the modern nation state in its democratic secular form. And so globalization, in other words, is the worldwide extension of a particular Latin Christian, racialized form of thinking that informs also institution, that is indissociable from the legacy of colonialism and its material condition of possibility, and above all, its colonial mentalities. So what is fundamentally at stake when we think about the return of religion and the political form in which that are supposed to respond to this problematic? We have to think through an hegemonic political grammar, so that according to this view, perhaps democracy is secular not because of the universal validity of democracy as secular, but because of its hegemonic role. I will now move to my reflection on democracy. So the organizing idea of this section is that I will talk of democracy in terms of sovereignty. Not only because Derrida does it, but also because the idea of sovereignty maximally displays this form of foundational fundamentalist thinking. Now, Derrida refers to democracy as democracy to come. This notion escapes a straightforward explanation, partly because of its odd propositional outlook. It doesn't have a verb. Partly because Derrida is not very precise has difficulties in defining precisely, but because of the matter it addresses. So it is in the context of the international political order that Derrida talks about democracy to come as a modern democratic regimes, but also as a form to talk about a novel understanding of reason. So what I will try to do in the first part of my exposure of his view on democracy, I will try just to draw the broad contours of his understanding. So democracy to come, Derrida clarifies, is neither an idea in Platonic terms, is not a model or a paradigm, is not an ideal in Aristotelic terms, something that we have to realize, is not a regulative idea in Kantian sense, an idea that help us organize and systematize our thinking. Derrida think of it in aporetic term. Now, from Greek etymology, aporia means non-passage or without passage. It refers to the fact that a theory or a concept is characterized by a tension, by a double pole, and there is no possibility to logically solve or logically determine this tension. The very fact of being in a aporetic situation, first of all, opposes a form of essentialist thinking. Philosophically or logically, you can't determine which of the two poles is gonna prevail. But at the same time, because it's not oppositional, it cannot be resolved logically, it points to the fact that the understanding that results from any concept that is understood in a aporetic term is related to a political decision of how that understanding has to be taken. And so if you think about perhaps democracy and its composition through the values of freedom and equality, is there more democracy if there is more equality, or is there more democracy if there is freedom? And so Derrida thinks that we can't resolve logically this question. It's an historical political question. And so if we think democracy without the modal verb to be as democracy to come remains ontologically and semantically free. It's not determined other than every time anew. And so this is not simply a logical question for Derrida. It is also inscribed in the history of political thinking and in the historical form that democracy has taken. If we take history of political thinking, from Aristotle to Rousseau, Mill, and Tocqueville, they've all grappled with the question of how to reconcile freedom and equality. But if you look at the historical variation also of democracy, in ancient time it was monarchic, plutocratic, and tyrannical. In modern time, we find model of constitutional democracy under monarchies, representative parliamentary democracy, liberal democracy, social democracy, republican democracy, authoritarian democracy, you name it. So the variation at work in the concept of democracy points to the fact that it is a sort of concept without a concept. It's a concept that is an empty space that is every time determined according to history and politics. And so democracy to Kant point to, in fact, to the historicity and plasticity intrinsic to democracy itself. Now, to go to the understanding what the to come means requires exiting a little bit from a political question and think about time. I will do this in a very cursory way to point to the underlying philosophical principle of this understanding, of a different understanding of time for Derrida. So Derrida conceived of time in non-teleological or messianic terms, and he refers to it in French as avenir. He plays with the term avenir. So use as a one word, avenir means future, but avenir, it's a play with the fact that is in the future, but is not the democracy of the future. Now, his opposition to the traditional view of time has to do with the fact that time has been traditionally from Aristotle up to Heidegger in the Western tradition. conceived synchronically as an infinite succession of moments that connect past, present, and future. Each of these moments can be grasped in its own unity. Now, this type of thinking for Derrida goes back to the metaphysical present. The moment you are able to isolate one unit of time, do you do it in time or outside time? The fact that you are able to isolate time while you are in time requires you to jump out of time. I can't go further on this, but I can discuss things later on. But the point to retain is that this type of thinking is rooted in a form of foundational metaphysical thinking, and is associated to a teleological form of thinking. Now, by teleological thinking, I refer to a type of thinking that is guided by a telos, an objective or a goal, to be realized or approximated. But the telos is grasped in the present immediately. That means independently from the condition in which it appears. If we think about what does it mean to be a human being, what is justice, what is freedom, what is the meaning of democracy, is grasped in the present, and then you organize society and politics towards this telos by setting, in fact, the horizon of expectation. Now, this type of thinking is associated to a foundational view of reason, as I mentioned, but also a calculative view of reason from the present, once you have grasped the essence of the human and how human can be peacefully living together according to an idea of the good, a universally shareable idea of the good, you calculate how to get there. This type of political theology has been disastrous in the experiences of fascism and communism, but it is also very problematic how it appears, in fact, in dominant liberal understanding. If we think of a dominant view in North America or in Europe, I have in mind the thought of John Rawls, philosopher John Rawls, or Jürgen Habermas, they all subscribe to this form of teleological thinking, and as most of all on an ideal orientation towards the future. Now, this ideal orientation established from the present, that the future of democracy is going to be liberal and secular. And this is despite the fact that there remains socioeconomic exclusion, oppression, but also the ineffectivity of liberalism to deal with white supremacy, apartheid, land theft, displacement, humanitarian wars, perhaps very much so because liberalism is entangled with them. And so Derrida wants really to move away from this understanding of time and conceive another possibility of thinking of time. So the name messianic that he uses to think about non-teleological view of time refers from its etymology to a religious language. But Derrida says that he has inherited from the tradition and the legacy of Marxism. In particular, he refers to the promise of emancipation and the injunction to change the world, famously stated by Marx in the 11th thesis of Feuerbach. Philosophers have interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. Now, when we think of the messianic and the promise of the future, the promise has to be understood in two ways. The first one is temporal, and the second is linguistic. So I will look first at the temporal one. So what interests Derrida in this promise is not what is promised in the future, but the form of the promise. What does it make this promise? In fact, Derrida looks at the possibility of understanding this messianism independently from what content is going to have. So the idea is that the form of the promise regards not so much any particular future, but the fact that there is going to be future. So the structure of the promise essentially logically requires that for the future to be future, that is not a replica of the present or of the past, it has to be indeterminate. Otherwise, it's not future. You can call it another way. So what interests Derrida in the form of the promise is that it promises an undeterminate future. It remains open. And so in this sense, it opposes teleological thinking insofar as you don't establish from the present what is going to be the future. The future is not going to be a future present. The second component of the promise that I mentioned is related to an aspect of language and a question of faith, but not understood in religious terms. Every time we give a promise, we give our words. And so we ask for trust, but also we trust the convention of the community we refer to. So for Derrida, there is an elemental faith, a minimal trust, an elemental faith, a faith without dogma, though, a minimal trust that is involved in any form of social relationship, social political relationship, but a minimal faith that also organizes scientific endeavors. In fact, even science and knowledge suppose faith, minimal faith in their activities because they require a minimal background of trustworthiness in order, in the scientific convention that regulates, in fact, scientific scholarship, in order to be effective at all. Now, because this faith is in its calling religious, but not only religious, there is a minimal faith at the limit of reason. And this is Derrida's response to the possibility of simply separating religion and faith. It is a difficult thought. I'm conscious of it. But a point to retain here is that if at the foundation of both epistemological and political order there is an element of faith, then there is an impossibility of closure of this horizon. And the fact that they are also politicized because it has been on an act of faith, not on an act of reason. And so if at the basis of political and epistemological order there is a minimal trust, then things could be otherwise. And so the possibility of closure is impeded even logically. Now, considering together these elements, for Derrida, all these elements help articulating a different understanding of reason. It's not a foundational understanding of reason that exercises a certain mastery on the present and on reality and calculate how we proceed towards the future. But it's a different understanding of reason in the sense that it also deals with what is uncalculable. For Derrida, it is an understanding of reason that opens up of a different understanding of the possible. He calls a different understanding of the possible is impossible, which is not the negative of the possible. It's not impossible in the sense we cannot do it, but is impossible in the sense that is impossible according to our present condition and understanding. It doesn't mean that it's not possible in the future. So, in other words, this understanding of reason thinks about the incalculable, to give an account of what cannot be calculated without counting it from the present, without determining it from the present. And so in this sense, it opens up the possibility of encountering difference before assimilating it from the available structure of thought and politics. And so if we go back to the question of modern secular discourse, whenever we approach a religious difference, the global knowledge circulating around the world, international institutions and political institutions are all informed by a particular understanding of religion and a particular understanding of the political domain. Well, there is a chance in which reason becomes dialogical before being normative. And so there is a possibility in thinking about it of reconsidering together, in fact, the term of the game, rather than setting the term of the game and see who does fit or not. And so what are the implications of this, thinking of democracy to come in this term and thinking of reason in this term? Well, it is another understanding of the political. It is a political that is not closed from the present. It's a political that doesn't establish in rigid ways what are the criteria of membership. It is a political that doesn't rely on fundamental hierarchies. But also, because faith is at the basis of the political, a minimal faith, it interrupts every form of social bond that is either based on claim of blood and birth, so rooting in form of, we can call it racism, or socially constructed through form of social contracts. And I want to read another quote here. So, thought in this way, democracy to come, indeed translate or call for a militant and interminable political critique. It is a weapon aimed at the enemies of democracy. It protests against all naivete and every political abuse, rhetoric that would present as present or existing democracy, as a de facto democracy, what remains inadequate to democratic demand. whether nearby or far away, at home or somewhere else in the world. Anywhere that a discourse on human rights and democracy remains little more than an obscene alibi, so long as it tolerates the terrible plight of so many millions of human beings suffering from malnutrition, disease, and humiliation, grossly deprived not only of bread and water, but of equality or freedom, dispossessed of the right of all, of everyone, of anyone. So conceived, democracy to come offered the possibility of a political critique of what democracy is and should be. So historically determined democracy is not equal to democracy with capital D. So democracy to come unsettle all those views about democracy that claim a privileged right to know what democracy is and should be. And it offered theoretical sources and space to think through, criticize, politicize, historicize, which means denaturalize, claims about the truth of democracy in theory and practice. I move on now to the Derrida reflection on democracy as a form of sovereignty. Now, as a minimal understanding of sovereignty for Derrida, it's an indivisible and absolute power to give, make, or suspend the law. Now, why is this relevant? Since its birth in ancient Greece, democracy, in its definition, was a form of sovereign power. So the very idea of kratos, kratia, demokratia, kratos of the people, of the demos, is a form of sovereign power that enforced the law. So what is important in this definition is that there is a power associated to an agent that gives his own law in a self-determining fashion. Now, Derrida evokes the figure of the will in order to think about the form of agency involved in democracy. It is a will that in turning, starting from itself, from its own cause, and returning to itself, it does so in an undifferentiated way, undivided way. So Derrida uses this figure in order to think about the indivisibility of sovereignty. And he thinks that indivisibility, which is associated, in fact, to a theological future, has been constant, in fact, through the history of political thought, not simply in the Western tradition, from Plato and Aristotle to Baudin and Hobbes, up to Tocqueville, Schmitt, but also democratic sovereignty. Now, one quotation from Tocqueville, thinking about democratic sovereignty in the United States, is very punctual to make the point I'm trying to advance here. So Tocqueville says, "The people reign over the American political world as God reigns over the universe. It is the cause and end of all things." So the cause and the end, a form of self-sufficiency, and there is a direct relationship between the view of the people as a unitary subject and God. So Derrida's point is that democracy and sovereignty are linked by a long tradition of political theology that connects ancient conceptualization of sovereignty as theological and masculine to contemporary ones. Now, what is distinctive of this view is not simply that democracy is a form of sovereignty, many others have said it before, but the fact that the source of its authority is connected to an idea of a sovereign unified agent that maintains, in fact, this theological feature of unity, indivisibility, and uses force, in fact, to affirm itself. So the idea is that the agent has changed over time, but the concept of agency has remained the same. Now, one example, staying with the American case, when we think about the American Declaration of Independence, and it's only paradigmatic, it's exemplary, we can take other example. And we think about the unified character of the people. Now, John Jay, one of the founding fathers, said that after the declaration refers to one people with same language, same ancestors, and same political principle. Now, at the time of the declaration, if you think about languages present in the territory of the United States, we have English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and native Indian languages, including the population referring to these languages. And so the appeal to a fictional discourse that rationalizes, in fact, naturalizes the origin of a political community in terms of a unified body, it's particularly problematic and very dangerous. In fact, it seems to me that whenever a unified origin are invoked and naturalized in a discourse about sovereignty, we're never far from a discourse of racism, the set-up hierarchies of what counts as valuable, as morally valuable and politically valuable, and also set the possibility of separation. I was talking about indivisibility. So the second point with regard to sovereignty is the idea of exceptionality. And with this, Derrida refers to the possibility of suspending the law or democratic procedure, both in international and domestic law. Now, there's a reference here, and I can't go too much into it, is to Carl Schmitt, which was not a democratic thinker. But the idea is that for Schmitt, unless we understand the foundation of the political in modern times through a theological structure, we don't understand the foundation of the political. Insofar as the foundation of the law, because it's above the law, goes into a zone that seems to be contiguous with some metaphysical theological space. And so for Schmitt, the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. And the exception is placed above the law, suspending, in fact, the legal system. And so if we look at a more concrete example in domestic and international politics, Derrida has in mind, for instance, Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, which is regulated by democratic principle. And so Article 51 says the only exception to the jurisdiction of the United Nations Security Council and recognize the individual and collective right of self-defense against armed attack until the Council has established the necessary measure to restore order. Now, Derrida points to the fact that the American administration since 1993, American governments, have declared that they would make use of Article 51, not simply with self-defense, but whenever they deemed appropriate to defend their vital interests. So we are having here a question of access to the market, energy supply, strategic resources. The entire discussion of rogue states and the possibility of establishing who is a rogue state, both in terms of organization or state, has been used by the American administration through the exceptionality of Article 51 to pursue to place itself above the law. But other example of exceptionality can be considered after 9/11. The bypassing of democratic procedure in order to establish extreme control on Muslim population, or we think the suspension of civil liberty in the United States, or what is happening in Guantanamo. And so the idea of thinking of democracy in terms of indivisibility and exceptionality is not to avoid the fact that in modern time, modern democracy is also about multiplicity, heterogeneity, and division. But the idea is mostly this one. The problem with democratic sovereignty is that the agent exercising the sovereign function retains a prerogative of withdrawal from the law that is revived in time of exception. Now, although modern democracy is characterized by the division of power, typical of Locke of Montesquieu, so that the judiciary, executive, and legislative are opposed to each other, what remains constant is that the constituting logic of sovereignty is characterized by the same concept of selfhood that still present theological future. And these are invoked precisely in name of security and secularism to protect democracy but put the minority at risk. Once again, let's think about the Islamophobia legislation after 9/11. So in sum, the problem with sovereignty so conceived is not only that it's not really not religious, it's not really purely secular, because it's still informed by a tradition of political theology, but also it taps into strategies of naturalization that are dangerously related to form of racialized thinking. In order to provide an alternative to this view, Derrida articulated the view of autoimmunity. It's another difficult concept. So the idea of autoimmunity is another iteration of his view of aporia. He develops it in thinking how the notion of autoimmunity is used in biology in connection to immunity. So immunity is designating the production of antibody as a defense against antigens. So in relation to immunity, autoimmunity would be the suspension of the protections. And so the suspension of the protection is the suspension of what provide the structure to a living organism to maintain its identity over time. And so it introduces a sense of suspension of life within the organism itself. And so it introduces an element of death within life. And so it is a sort of Freudian death drive within the organism. And so this view of autoimmunity counter the idea of the unified, indivisible selfhood of sovereignty, insofar as it points to the impossibility of self-identity. If there is a possibility of suspending oneself, suspending what guarantees, in fact, the persistence of identity, you can't close the identity of the self from neither from the present nor from the future. Now, I will give you an example to think about how is this related to democracy. So Derrida thinks that this form of opening, as I mentioned before, is to be considered in terms of unconditionality. And as I said, it's not that it's beyond experience, it's not beyond space and time, as Kant understood unconditionality, but unconditionality is beyond the condition of the present. If we think in the tradition of democracy for Derrida, this autoimmunity has been present since the get-go. It's a sort of a suicidal future of democracy. Democracy, since the Greek, has tried to protect both freedom and equality. But in equally protecting freedom, an understanding of democracy as we have received it from the tradition allows that a majority can take over power and suspend democracy itself. Now, Aristotle tried to avoid this problem through the idea of alternation. Different groups would alternate in deciding in the government. In modern time, there is always the risk, in fact, that the alternative to democracy can be represented as democratic alternation. So not having democracy anymore can be represented as a form of democratic alternation. Now, concrete example. If we think of fascism and Nazism, they went to power through democracy. And so through democratic means. Derrida gives us an example of 1992 Algeria, when democratic procedure were suspended because exit poll would give the Front Islamique de Salut winning, and there were clear indication or strong indication that it would have suspended democracy. And so democracy suspends itself in order to continue to be democracy. That's the idea of autoimmunity. The same discourse can be seen at work in Guantanamo, the suspension of civil liberty. It is necessary to suspend democratic liberty in order to protect democracy itself. I'm getting too close. So, but what is extremely, I think, useful as a concept of autoimmunity is to think the radical criticism that democracy as a system allows for itself. Last quote. Democracy to come takes into account the absolute and intrinsic historicity of the only system that welcomes in itself, in its very concept, that expression of autoimmunity called the right to self-critique and perfectibility. Democracy is the only system, the only constitutional paradigm in which, in principle, one has or assumes the right to criticize everything publicly, including the idea of democracy, its concept, its history, and its name, including the idea of the constitutional paradigm and the absolute authority of the law. It is thus the only paradigm that is universalizable, whence its chance and its fragility. So the possibility of radical criticism that is allowed by democracy itself, it goes as far as questioning the very nature, understanding, historical determination of what democracy is. And this is why, going beyond Derrida, I think that this right to question whether what appears to be the natural form of democracy can be extended to the question whether purely secular understanding and form of democracy are adequate to demands of the democratic spirit in the current predicament. And so whether this affects all those secular positions that consider a strict separation between religion and politics as required by the modern democratic demands for the respect of pluralism. So it would be a sort of, mine is a suggestion that democracy can be taught beyond secularism. And in thinking democracy in these terms, it's a way that questions, both in method and content, the dominant modality of thinking of democracy as a strictly non-religious sovereign power of the people, an attempt to move beyond a separatist Western Latin horizons and the exclusionary implications that we have seen that are associated to the globalization of secular modernity. But let me be very clear. In suggesting democracy beyond secularism, I do not advocate or suggest that we should turn to a religious or theocratic-based politics. I do not negate, neither Derrida does, the differentiation or the dissociation of political power, religious authority and political power. What I'm suggesting about this view of democracy to come is that it offers the possibility to expand the imaginary beyond perspectives that end up set in division between the political and the non-political, close horizon, secular Christianity, and set up hierarchies that are racial, spiritual, sexual, on the basis of question philosophical assumptions that are justified, in fact, to a hidden politics. And so it's clearly that there is a risk involved in opening up this possibility of losing what we know are democratic established liberty. But yet it seems to me that it is a valuable attempt to denaturalize sedimented conviction about politics and clearing a space for positions, religious and non-religious, in the West and beyond the West, that offer important contribution to democratic thinking and practices without necessarily embrace modern secularism. It is an attempt to open up the grammar, to open up a space for new grammar to emerge. And let me close with a question. Is a non-secular Western future possible? But most importantly, is it desirable? I hope that my talk gave a sense of where I'm going with this. Thank you very much. Yes. So we can take some questions.
Thank you so much, although it's a bit philosophical, which is quite some brain draining. What's a bit surprising is that I think I just felt that democracy here it has so many different definitions. But I would like to ask you, can we separate these two items by introducing democracy as a process and secularism as an outcome of this process? And then the role of democracy somehow come to an end, and space is given more to secularism with all its components. And my second question is that democracy can't become global democracy, because after all, democracy is the rule of the people. So in fact, if we limit democracy to only limit certain areas, the outcome will be different from one place to another. So is the world heading towards global democracy or even more localized democracy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in the first question, are you referring to separating these two elements? The two elements you refer to are democracy and secularism? Now, historically, they have developed together. The question, if we see also in the genealogical development of democracy, was democracy for whom and at the expenses of whom, both externally and internally. And so the question is to see whether we move beyond the rhetoric of democracy and we see what have been the human costs of establishing the type of democracy that we know today that proclaims freedom and equality for all, but in fact is for few. That would be my sense, my response to this. With regard to the idea of global democracy, well, what is becoming global? It's a particular understanding of democracy that is the fact that modern discourse is structures, international institution, global capitalism, international law and politics, makes it makes it appears that democracy as we know it today is in fact democracy with capital D. So it's the essence of democracy. But that is what I've been trying to questioning all along. And I try to point to the fact that this type of thinking is associated, in fact, to a racialized form of thinking that has elevated one particular understanding of reason, democracy, so on and so forth, as the understanding.
Thank you. Would you consider anarchy as democracy beyond the secular?
So, by definition, democracy is a kratos, is a kratia. Anarchy is without kratia. Yes, and so, logically, it seems to me, analytically, the idea of anarchy is the opposite of democracy, because it negates the possibility of arcos, of principle so arcos is another way of talking about sovereignty. In what way do you see it applicable to human structure?
So it assumes government in order to attack it.
But if we want to retain the idea that there is a government of the people with anarchy, I don't see where the people is gone anymore.
Yeah, but why it's not a democracy?
Because the people is not there anymore. How do you think the people the idea that the people are governing in an anarchy, in an anarchist system? It is.
Govern.
And so how can you see that there is a form of democratic thinking there, or democratic practice?
Yeah, well, it is democracy beyond government, without hierarchy, which is... not popular. Anarchy is the deconstruction of society as
but
having the government as a cornerstone, which requires democracy.
But where is the possibility of ruling in an anarchist system?
Yeah, well, then democracy has to be redefined to include this new vision of living.
I mean, the attempt that my attempt here was in fact opening up the possibility or rethinking democracy. And it seems to me that there is a structural tension between anarchism and democracy in itself, because democracy nevertheless requires the government of the people.
I understand. This is why, if it necessitates the governing of people, then why it's democracy? Which goes back to the same paradox. But if you understand what I mean.
Maybe I'm not understanding what they're saying, but the definition of democracy and in its historical inheritance has been democratia, the government of the people. So you have to have a form of the people governing. In an anarchical system, you are opposed, in fact, to the principle of the possibility of having an organized system of rule.
Yeah, but people are free and equal.
So, but we're... Well, that it has to be seen, because if anarchy allows the freedom to think of freedom of equality, in which way possible, I can also deny your freedom and equality.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. I don't have a question. I think this opened up a question in my head as to whether or not we can use religion to actually promote democracy. And when I say use religion, a reformed version of it, which actually empowers people as opposed to what is happening right now. I don't know if this is something you thought about during your research or you read about. So that's just the note. Thank you.
I mean, a quick reaction to that would be that, can we eliminate religion from the public space or ethics? And so the very idea that religion was gone in a secular system was hidden by the fact that the basic understanding of secularism were indebted to Protestant Christianity. And so religion was playing a role, a hidden one, that was obscured by the fact that secularism poses itself in neutral terms. So yes, I would see the opening to a religious tradition as giving, in fact, substance to articulation of how to live together.
Thanks. Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I was thinking about, it seems to me that you're redefining democracy beyond sort of the hegemonic definition of it and trying to make it more accessible to perhaps religious explanations. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about individual choice and maybe even popular movements in terms of this concept of democracy beyond secularism.
Okay, so I think, so let me respond to this with a background preface. I think that we are at a stage of the production of knowledge that is dominated by the West. The university is westernized. There are research done that the sources in the humanities and social sciences come from 5 countries: France, Italy, Germany, the UK, and North America. And so the concept available to think about reality comes also from those. And so I found particularly helpful to think about the condition of knowledge today through what the African philosopher Valentin Mudimbe names the colonial library. To know about the reality today, we are in the colonial library. And so how do we navigate the world if we are in the colonial library? How do we relate to it, but try to exit it as well? And so I think that the resources that Derrida offers to navigate the colonial library is to open up a space for a different grammar to emerge. And so in that space, I would see popular movement as well. Now, the question is, do we really have a complex understanding of how far secularism has gone? Whether we reject it or we have internalized it. And it seems to me that it has gone so far that it's very difficult to criticize, to see the level at which it has reached in order to be able to criticize it.
I think it's somehow related to the question of the previous question, is that are they cultures, certain cultures, more prone to democracy? And whether this interfaith dialogue ongoing on, especially in Jordan, it's a very center of interfaith discussions and dialogue headed by our Majesty King Hussein, whether this can promote harmony among different segments of society in itself promote democracy. Thank you.
Is it a comment or a question?
No, a question, because I'm not sure whether it does or it doesn't.
So the point for me is that you don't exclude it up front that it does. I mean, secularism wants religion in the private sphere. As long as religion is in the private sphere, it cannot articulate either public movement or decision at the parliamentary level. Now, what does in principle prevent, in fact, organizing a questioning of political power from the point of view of religion? And so it seems to me that it is precisely because secularism is trying to confront religion at the level of belief and thinking that the type of belief religion proposes are illusionary. But that is an historical event. It's a historical event associated to the Reformation. It's associated to a moment where it's the birth of nation-state, science, and the end of the religious war. And so religion in pre-modern time in Europe was considered as a form of practice, not to think about what does it mean translate through the idea of religion, if you use the Arabic term din. Din, in my understanding, I mean, you know more better than me, in my understanding is much larger than a question of belief. Now, try to privatize a way of life. What would that mean? What is the force involved in doing that? But also, what are the resources that are lost in thinking about how to articulate views of living together?
So how does this work then in societies like Asian, if we look into Asia, where they don't have the burden of the Abrahamic religions, Judeo-Christian traditions that you've been talking about that sort of crafted this concept of democracy and secularism. But in countries where they don't have that burden of dealing with even being secular, because how does democracy then form itself in these cultures? India is an example of you talked about the problems now of India, but a country with many gods and religions and all these things, does it matter really?
Well, the question maybe is whether we agree or disagree on the scope of modern discourse. Has modern discourse reached globally or not? And if it has, in my understanding it has, through the exporting of the form of the state as the nation state, as the structure of the state during colonial time. It seems to me that modern democracy in India is still very much influenced by a dominant nationality. It has brought with itself the structural secular system. And so the ubiquity, in my understanding, of this process has created a situation so that we can't avoid the question of the secular. Because the secular for so long time has been presented. If we think of, for instance, a question of knowledge production today, it is inconceivable that knowledge is not secular. The question of the secular is not simply a question of the relation between religion and politics. It's a methodological question about how we look at the world.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cassatella. This concludes the Q&A segment. We'd like to thank you again so much for your presentation. And if you have any more questions, you can ask Dr. Cassatella at the reception near the main entrance. Thank you.